The Young and the Restless spoilers. Jack Abbott had been patient far too long, and patience had become a luxury he could no longer afford. The decisions he made for Jabot had always carried a mixture of love, guilt, and responsibility, an exhausting blend that defined his years at the helm. But this time, as Billy once again stormed into his office demanding funds for yet another one of his grand visions, Jack felt something shift. It wasn't just irritation, it was recognition. He could see clearly that Billy's desperation wasn't about strategy or loyalty. It was about ego, control, and the deep-seated need to prove that he could outshine the shadow of his older brother. Jack didn't raise his voice or argue. Instead, he drew the financial line that Billy refused to see, the truth that Jabot's cash reserves would not be squandered for another of Billy's impulsive adventures. He told him plainly that the company's liquidity needed to be preserved for the potential Arabesque takeover, a move that could define Jabot's future in global markets. It wasn't personal, it was practical. But to Billy Abbott, practicality sounded like betrayal. Billy couldn't accept that his brother would prioritize the company's stability over his vision. He felt mocked, diminished, and patronized. Every conversation with Jack seemed to echo the same dynamic. The responsible brother lecturing, the reckless one defending his fire. But this time, Billy was convinced Jack had ulterior motives. When Jack calmly mentioned that Sally Spectra would soon oversee Abbott Communications while he retained the CEO position, Billy's eyes narrowed. It was an unexpected announcement, one that made him wonder whether Sally's presence was just a convenient distraction or part of a larger strategy that Jack was quietly building behind closed doors. Billy didn't know that before he burst into Jabot that morning, Jack had already held a video call with Jill Abbott, the family's sharp-minded matriarch, to coordinate strategy and financial positioning. Jack and Jill had reached an understanding, one that excluded Billy from the conversation entirely. That, more than anything, wounded him. Because for Billy, being excluded meant being underestimated, and being underestimated meant being irrelevant. Meanwhile, outside the corporate walls of Jabot, the storm was also brewing in Billy's personal life. Sally Spectra, his fiery and ambitious partner, was nearing the breaking point. Her patience had stretched thin, torn between loyalty and exhaustion. Billy's volatility was no longer charming or exciting, it was draining. Sally had watched him chase victories only to self-sabotage when success came within reach. She had believed in his potential, but lately, that belief had begun to feel like delusion. Their relationship had reached the delicate stage where silence became louder than words. The tension followed her even on her morning walks through Chancellor Park, where she often found herself confiding in Audra Charles, one of the few people who could understand the blend of chaos, ambition, and heartbreak that Genoa City seemed to breed. Audra, for all her own personal wreckage, had a strange empathy for Sally. Both women were survivors in their own ways, ambitious, resilient, and painfully aware that their worth was too often measured by the men who underestimated them. As they sat together one afternoon, Sally's words came out heavy, her voice trembling beneath the surface calm. She spoke of Billy's unpredictability, his inability to commit to stability, his restless need to provoke conflict even when peace was possible. Audra didn't interrupt. She simply listened, knowing that sometimes silence was the only kind of support a person needed. The Chancellor Park breeze carried their words like confessions, mixing regret with the faint scent of spring, and in that quiet moment, Sally felt something inside her shift. She realized that love wasn't supposed to feel like this, like waiting for an explosion that never ends. What Sally didn't know, however, was that she was now standing at the crossroads of two dangerous alliances. By accepting Jack's offer to lead Abbott Communications, she was unknowingly positioning herself in the middle of a family war. Jack admired her talent and her strategic mind, but he was also pragmatic enough to know that her connection to Billy could become both a weakness and a weapon. Sally, for her part, was torn between ambition and affection. The idea of rebuilding her career under the Abbott brand felt like redemption. Yet, she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that she was being drawn into something larger, a storm that could destroy her relationship and her reputation in one blow. Back at Jabot, Jack faced the weight of leadership with the quiet resolve of a man who had seen too many empires fall because of pride. He didn't relish denying his brother. In truth, it broke something inside him each time he had to treat Billy not as family but as a liability. Yet the Arabesque acquisition loomed over every decision, and Jack knew it was a battle that required precision, not passion. Billy's insistence on pulling money from company reserves was not just reckless, it was dangerous. The competition was fierce, the markets unstable, and any sign of internal division could weaken Jabot's position. Still, Jack's biggest challenge wasn't external, it was emotional. Each confrontation with Billy reopened old wounds, reminding him of their father's legacy, the family's fractured loyalties, and the impossible task of protecting both blood and business. Every time he saw Billy's eyes flare with resentment, he saw the reflection of his own guilt. Billy's resentment festered. He began to see conspiracies in every decision Jack made. The timing of Jack's meeting with Jill, the sudden elevation of Sally, the secrecy surrounding Arabesque, all of it felt orchestrated to edge him out. And perhaps, in some way, he wasn't entirely wrong. Jack had begun to build alliances behind the scenes, ensuring that Jabot would survive even if Billy turned against him. To Jack, it was strategy. To Billy, it was betrayal. Late at night, alone in his apartment, Billy replayed every conversation with Jack, every moment when his brother had smiled with that infuriating calmness. He poured himself another drink, convincing himself that he was being pushed out of his own family's legacy. His anger became the oxygen that kept him going, and beneath that anger, there was fear, the fear that he was becoming irrelevant in a story that had once revolved around him. Sally tried to save what little was left of their relationship, but even her patience had limits. She began to realize that love built on chaos couldn't survive peace. When she looked at Billy now, she saw a man lost between pride and self-destruction, a man fighting ghosts that no longer existed. She wanted to help him, but she also knew that saving Billy often meant losing herself. And Audra, who had once envied Sally's romantic stability, now watched her friend unravel, understanding too well that Genoa City had a way of consuming even the strongest hearts. Their conversation in the park became a metaphor for their lives, two women trying to find sense amid a world that thrived on secrets, ambition, and betrayal. Jack, unaware of the depth of the chaos his decisions had unleashed, continued to move forward with quiet calculation. The alliance with Jill strengthened his position, but it also came with moral compromises. Every deal, every secret conversation felt like another brick in a wall that separated him from the people he loved. And though he would never admit it aloud, Jack knew that his greatest enemy wasn't Billy, it was time. Time had eroded trust, loyalty, and innocence. What remained was survival. As the sun set over Genoa City, the Abbott family, once united by name and legacy, stood divided by ambition and resentment. Billy, in his anger, began to contemplate his next move. He wasn't going to let Jack or anyone else dictate his path. But what he didn't see was that his rebellion was walking him straight into a trap of his own making. The line between family and rivalry had blurred beyond recognition. Sally was drifting away, Jack was fortifying his empire, and Billy was becoming the very thing he swore he'd never be, an outsider in his own story. The tragedy was not that the Abbotts were fighting. It was that they no longer knew what they were fighting for. And so, Genoa City braced for another chapter of deceit, heartbreak, and the illusion of control, because in this world, every act of love was also an act of war, and every victory carried the price of betrayal. Sally Spectra had reached the edge of her endurance. Her relationship with Billy had been a slow unraveling, the kind that doesn't collapse in one dramatic explosion but crumbles piece by piece, until there is nothing left to hold on to. For months, she had waited for signs of change, believing that the man she loved would eventually rise from his self-inflicted chaos. But instead of redemption, Billy dug himself deeper into the pit he swore he would escape. His obsession with proving his worth, with chasing validation in business and in love, had finally pushed Sally to her breaking point. It wasn't just about his failures, it was about the way he carried them, refusing to see how his recklessness pulled her down with him. The final straw came when he found himself entangled in yet another political and corporate disaster, aligning with forces he didn't understand, gambling everything for pride. That was when she knew she had to walk away, or she would lose herself completely. Billy, blinded by frustration, refused to face what was slipping away, so he turned to the only person he believed could save him, his brother Jack. Jack Abbott had spent a lifetime walking the fine line between family loyalty and corporate duty, but even he could sense that the walls were closing in. The situation surrounding Jabot had reached a boiling point. Kane Ashby's resurgence in the business world was no longer a rumor, it was a threat. Ambitious, cunning, and relentless, Kane had positioned himself as a silent predator waiting for the right moment to strike. For Jack, protecting the Abbott legacy was not simply about keeping Jabot alive, it was about preserving decades of history, hard work, and the Abbott name that his father had built from the ground up. He knew Kane would exploit every weakness, including the fractures within the family itself, to seize control. That was why Jack made a decision that surprised even himself, to reach across the enemy line and propose an alliance with Victor Newman. To approach Victor required a kind of courage and humility that did not come easily to Jack. Their rivalry had spanned decades, two titans forever locked in a battle of wit, power, and pride. But this was not the time for grudges. The survival of Jabot demanded strategy, not sentiment. Jack understood that Newman Enterprises was one of the few forces capable of counterbalancing Kane's influence. It was a risky move, aligning with a man he could neither trust nor admire, but Jack's instincts told him it was the only viable path forward. Victor, as expected, did not greet the idea warmly. His smirk carried the weight of history, the unspoken reminder that he had bested Jack before, and could easily do so again. Yet beneath his skepticism lay a flicker of respect. Victor understood power, and he understood survival. Like Jack, he saw Kane's ambitions as a destabilizing threat to the delicate ecosystem of Genoa City's business landscape. Reluctantly, Victor agreed to a temporary alliance. For both men, it wasn't friendship. It was strategy, a calculated move to contain a growing danger. Jill Abbott played an unspoken but critical role in the entire arrangement. Her connection to Kane was both personal and strategic, making her a valuable bridge in this corporate chess match. Jill's wisdom came not from calculation but from experience. She had seen too many empires rise and fall, too many men lose themselves in ego-driven wars. To her, Kane's rise was not an opportunity but a warning. His hunger for validation, masked by charm and ambition, mirrored the same recklessness that once drove Billy into self-destruction. Jill knew that Kane's next move would not just be about business, it would be personal, a vendetta wrapped in the illusion of progress. Her conversations with Jack were sharp, purposeful, and filled with the kind of insight that only comes from hard-earned scars. Together, they understood that the only way to defeat Kane was to think like him but act with restraint. Billy, however, remained blind to the larger picture. While Jack and Victor were aligning forces to safeguard Jabot's legacy, Billy was drowning in the illusion of his own importance. His mind was a constant battlefield of insecurity and ambition. He believed he was being sidelined, that his brother's secret meetings and strategic decisions were deliberate acts of exclusion. He couldn't grasp that Jack's alliance with Newman Enterprises wasn't a betrayal, it was a shield. Instead, he saw it as proof that he was being cut out of the family's destiny. His obsession with control, already frayed by his failures, began to consume him. Sally's departure had left a void that he tried to fill with business schemes and emotional manipulation. But the truth was simple, Billy wasn't fighting for Jabot or Sally anymore. He was fighting for himself, for the fragile ego that could not bear to be irrelevant. Sally, meanwhile, began to rebuild herself in the aftermath of her decision to leave Billy. Her connection to Abbott Communications placed her in close proximity to Jack, and though she tried to keep her distance from the family's internal conflicts, she couldn't avoid the gravity of their world. Jack saw in her the kind of ambition that reminded him of his younger self, driven, passionate, unyielding, but he also recognized the vulnerability she tried to hide. Sally became an unexpected confidant, someone who understood the cost of survival in Genoa City. Yet even as she found stability in her work, the emotional residue of her past with Billy lingered. His absence was not peaceful, it was heavy. Every headline, every whisper of Jabot's shifting alliances, seemed to pull her back into a story she wanted to forget. Audra Charles continued to be her sounding board, helping her navigate the complicated intersection of love, career, and reputation. The friendship between the two women grew stronger, bound by mutual understanding that in a city of power players, sincerity was the rarest currency. Jack's alliance with Victor quickly became the talk of the business world. It was an unprecedented move, one that sent shockwaves through Genoa City's elite. Competitors watched in disbelief as two longtime adversaries found common ground. Behind closed doors, the negotiations were tense, filled with unspoken mistrust and sharp intellect. Jack and Victor shared no illusions about their arrangement. Each man viewed the other as a necessary evil. For Victor, the alliance was an opportunity to monitor and perhaps manipulate Jabot's trajectory. For Jack, it was a chance to buy time, to fortify his company against Kane's inevitable strike. The irony was not lost on either of them, that two men defined by rivalry would now have to rely on one another to preserve their legacies. Meanwhile, Kane Ashby was watching. He had always been a strategist, patient enough to wait for the perfect opening. To him, Jack's partnership with Victor wasn't a deterrent, it was a challenge. He understood that fear was the most potent weapon in business, and the Abbott-Newman alliance was an admission of fear. It told him that they saw him as a threat, and that knowledge only emboldened him further. Kane began to move quietly, gathering influence through smaller subsidiaries, forming alliances with disgruntled shareholders, and exploiting every public doubt surrounding Jabot's leadership. His charm made him disarming, his intelligence made him dangerous, and his lack of moral restraint made him unpredictable. Jack knew this battle would not end quickly. The alliance with Victor was a temporary measure, a fragile truce built on necessity. But even as he tried to navigate the politics of the situation, the weight of family continued to press on him. Billy's resentment had turned into something darker, a kind of bitterness that made Jack uneasy. He saw in his brother's eyes the same reckless defiance that had destroyed him so many times before. And though Jack wanted to protect him, he also knew that saving Billy often meant sacrificing Jabot's future. This time, he couldn't afford it. Not with Kane circling like a wolf and Victor watching every move with predatory patience. Sally, unaware of the full scale of Jack's alliance, continued to be drawn into the Abbott orbit. Her name began to appear in business columns, her leadership at Abbott Communications quietly praised. Yet behind her professional success was a gnawing unease. She knew how fragile everything was. The Abbotts, for all their wealth and influence, were still human, flawed, passionate, and endlessly entangled in their own emotional wars. And in Genoa City, emotion was often more dangerous than ambition. Sally had escaped Billy's chaos, but she hadn't escaped the world that created him. Her proximity to Jack put her in the line of fire once more, as rumors began to swirl about her role in the Abbott strategy. The whispers suggested favoritism, manipulation, and hidden motives. Sally tried to ignore them, but she knew better than anyone how perception could destroy even the strongest foundations. In the end, Jack's greatest battle wasn't with Kane or even with Victor, it was with time and trust. He had built his life on the belief that he could protect everything that mattered if he just worked hard enough, planned carefully enough, and loved deeply enough. But Genoa City had a cruel way of teaching its residents that control is an illusion. As he stood in his office late one night, staring at the city lights reflected against the glass, Jack knew that the storm was far from over. Billy was out there, hurt and unpredictable. Sally was caught in the crossfire of loyalty and ambition. Victor was both ally and rival. And Kane Ashby, relentless, patient Kane, was waiting in the shadows, ready to strike when the first crack appeared in the Abbott armor. The future of Jabot, the Abbott family, and perhaps even Genoa City itself now rested on one truth. In a world built on legacy, every alliance comes with a cost, and every decision, no matter how noble, creates another enemy waiting just beyond the horizon.